Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very great pleasure to be here. And what I want to do is move, since I think we're already slightly behind schedule, and I understand this group needs a little bit of time to move from one location to another. Let me dive very quickly, if I may, into the substance of the talk that I have for you today, very much focused on the issues that Jeff raised before he handed the mic over to Marcus. So I'm going to be talking about your global strategy in the new landscape. And the focus, I'm not a macroeconomist, I'm a strategist, so the focus is going to be very much on not just what's happening out there, but what it means for all of you in your companies. Having said that, need to start with a little bit of context setting. And the reason some context setting is important is, as has already been mentioned at least twice this morning, these are uncertain times. If we think back 3-4 years ago, probably the dominant perspective on globalization, and many of you will recognize who the author of this quote was this notion that we lived in a world in which further progress at economic integration was irreversible. Governments were withering away and really didn't affect things much anymore, didn't have the power to do it in the face of strong globalization forces, and everything was getting interconnected seamlessly. That's not quite as popular a view these days. And a lot, of course, has to do with what we've experienced over the last 18 months. If we look at world trade, down by as much as 9% last year. If we think about foreign direct investment, that was down by about 15% in 2008, and more than 40% off that lower figure in 2009. Or to share with you the statistic that says it all in terms of explaining why no one is immune, sales of Cuban cigars are down by 15%, suggesting that even Cuba is not exempt from this kind of global contagion that we've seen sweeping over the world. So one of the things that these kinds of changes have led to is that there's actually competition that has broken out in terms of who is going to be the deglobalization guru. And a gentleman called Walden Bello has been officially recognized by The Economist as the father of deglobalization. And so we have a somewhat more contested view of what's going to happen going forward than was the case before the financial crisis struck. And it's starting to affect what companies do. I went and looked at the Fortune Global 100 companies and their letters to their shareholders in 2008. Mentions of globalization way down from 2007 and 2006, and mentions mostly in conjunction with performance issues, softness in revenues, all the kinds of issues that the financial crisis has unleashed for us. So, uncertain times, and as I try and give you some of my thoughts about what lies ahead, I'm actually going to walk through 3 different ways of thinking about what lies ahead. First of all, very briefly, I think it's useful to have a stable frame of reference, and so it's useful to remember that certain things haven't changed and that we might not want to overreact by becoming homebodies. Second, and this is where I start speculating more than telling you about data, what are the implications of the changes that we've already seen for your global strategy? And then finally, think a little bit about what the big constraints, what the big bumps in the road might be going ahead. And again, what the business leaders assembled in this room can do, should do, need to do in order to deal with those issues. So let me start with just one slide that makes, to my mind, very clear what has changed and what hasn't changed. And let me pick the statistic that's shown the biggest single drop-off since the global financial crisis started, the foreign direct investment numbers. So what I've done on this slide is simply take all the foreign direct investment that goes on in the world and divide it by gross fixed capital formation as a proxy for total investment, domestic and foreign, in the world. Couple of interesting things from looking at this historical tableau. Yes, there was a big drop-off in 2008, and since I didn't even have final 2009 numbers, I haven't put them on this slide. But in 2009, as best as we can tell, FDI fell to about 10% of global fixed capital formation. So that's the big drop-off. What hasn't changed? Well, I think the first thing that stands out from this slide is that this is not an unprecedented drop-off, and we don't even have to go back 50 or 75 years to the Great Depression to see something like that happening to the FDI numbers. All we have to do is think back to the beginning of the same decade, and we realize that a lot of FDI activity is really driven by mergers and acquisitions, which are as sensitive to stock market movements as they are shifts in real economic activity. And so if the current decline looks bad, let's just remember we went through something much more marked in absolute and in percentage terms back in 2000, 2001. So let's keep a sense of perspective. Second thing that I'd like to add off this slide is that if we look at where we are right now, or where we've been in the last 10 years, despite the drop-off, average FDI levels have averaged about 10, 11% through the course of this decade. That's roughly about twice the level in the 1990s. It's roughly about 4 times the levels in the 1980s. It's roughly 6 times the levels in the 1970s. So the notion that we're returning to some deglobalized world seems way premature if we look at where we actually are in relation to those historical parameters. And then, of course, the final thing to stress is that there's clearly lots of room for this number to go up, given the volatility that we've seen and the current downturn that we're experiencing. So the first thought I wanted to leave you with, it's, as Mark Twain said about Wagner's music, it's not as bad as it sounds. A lot of what you hear about globalization is perhaps not quite as bad as it sounds if we avoid focusing just on the last 18 months and recognize that this is a phenomenon that has historically come with a fair amount of volatility, and we can see that volatility even earlier in the millennium, around 2000, 2001. Having said that, you probably didn't come here to be told there's nothing new going on in the world. So I wanted to shift to what I really want to spend most of my time on this morning, which is talking a bit about what has changed. And this is a perilous, or what will change, and how that's going to affect your businesses. This is a perilous exercise, so I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to talk about changes that have already happened, or have almost already happened, that do have profound implications for your businesses. And I'm going to go relatively quickly, but I believe on the YPO, WPO website for this conference, there is an article of mine from the most recent issue of Harvard Business Review, not officially out yet, actually, that goes through some of these business implications in a bit more detail. So let me first start off with a conceptual example of what I mean by a safe prediction about the future.